Welcome, everybody. I'm Brian Woods with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources Climate Action Office, and I'm here with our contractor, SEI, and other guests to talk about the planned updates to the transportation sector baseline scenario in the Vermont LEAP model. It's 3 o'clock on April 8th, 2025. Just we'll go a quick round of introductions and we'll get right into the SEI presentation. So I'll start with you, Jane.
Good afternoon, everybody. Jane Lazorchak, Climate Action Office, Agency of Natural Resources, and I'll kick it over to Joey.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for taking the time. Johanna Miller, Joey. I work for the Vermont Natural Resources Council. I'm the appointed environmental rep on the Climate Council. Thanks again. Looking forward to digging in. I will kick it over to Jared.
Thanks, Joey. Hi, Jason and Sylvia and everyone. My name is Jared Duval. I serve on the Climate Council, appointed as the council seat to provide expertise in energy and data analysis. So my day job is with Energy Action Network, which does a lot of data tracking, research, and analysis on energy emissions in the economy, especially in the Vermont context. And have also served on the transportation, the technical advisory committee with Joey and with Brian and Jane, digging in on some of the transportation data and analysis that fed into the Cap and Invest report that came out recently that I'm sure you're familiar with. And it looks like Secretary Moore is off for call now, so happy to pass it over to you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Julie Moore, Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources and member of the Climate Council, the Steering Committee, as well as the Science and Data Subcommittee.
And Ari, I see you joined. We're just doing very brief introductions, and I'm going to pass it over to the SEI team. Ari, you on mute? Oh, I know Ari's from VTrans, so we're happy to have her. And then over to the SEI team.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Basie. I'm the Director of the Energy Modeling Program at SEI, and I'm pleased to be with you today to see some folks that I have met in the past and to meet some new ones. And I will hand it off to Sylvia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Silvia Ulloa. I work as a researcher for the Energy Modeling Program at SEI. Pleasure to meet you all, and thank you for taking the time for meeting with us today.
It's you're up, Jason.
All right, so we have the floor. I just wanted to be sure.
Yep, that's it. Let me know.
Follow procedure.
I think you can share your screen.
Very good. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and share our screen. Sylvia, would you please do that for us? And Sylvia is actually going to lead us through the slides, as Sylvia has been thinking through the restructuring of the transport modeling in the LEAP model. Just a reminder that we are talking about the baseline scenario in the modeling. So for us, that's going to comprise both updated historical data as well as a baseline business as usual projection into the future. And later on, not that much later on, we're going to be talking about mitigation scenarios in this model as well. But for today, it's really focused on the baseline model. And the reason why we've convened this meeting is really to talk a little bit about some model restructuring that we propose to do and to get feedback on whether the new structure is fit for purpose. And so, Sylvia, I'm going to turn the floor over to you to take us through these slides.
Thank you, Jason. Jane, I see your hand is up. Do you want to add something before we get started?
Yeah, I just wanted to flag that in preparation for this with Sylvia and Jason and Brian, and I think I said this in the email that Brian helped me craft that went out to the council, acknowledged that all the challenges that we're working under with timeline and tragedy are trying to provide this opportunity to really look at where there are going to be structural changes to the model. And we are also assuming that by inviting just counselors with a vested interest, as well as the Science and Data Subcommittee, that there's really some base understanding amongst all of you about the LEAP model. And we asked Sylvia and Jason not to sort of go into long sort of like orientation to LEAP and elsewhere, but I just wanted to sort of extend that understanding and baseline knowledge that we're sort of expecting folks to have in this space, and then suggest that I wouldn't hesitate to pause and, raise your hands along the way if you have questions, because Sylvia and Jason are excellent at answering them. And so please use this as an opportunity to really interact with them and ask questions. And maybe as we dive into transportation, I should say that the other branch of the LEAP model, if I remember correctly from our last conversation, where there are structural changes, is the residential sector of the RCI sector. However, those ones, Jason and Sylvia and Brian all felt were much more straightforward, and wouldn't sort of maybe have the same impact on the model. And so didn't feel like we needed to dive into those. And I will just say, and Sylvia and Jason can add to that if I misspoke or if there are any comments around the residential sector, but all of this, I'll just say, is sort of a precursor to review that you will all have the opportunity to do in May. We're just trying to head off any like significant comments or concerns that we might see from counselors or science and data subcommittee members then by having this one opportunity of this deep dive right now. It's not to say it's the only chance though for edits or comments. There'll be another chance later on.
Yeah. Thanks,
Okay, so
James.
with that, yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful and a good way to tee this up. And indeed, this why we're doing this focus on this sector is because the structural changes are a little bit more important. And there is going to be one structural change which we've decided to do in the residential modeling, and it's going to be twofold. I guess we're going to eliminate there was a distinction between residential versus commercial, between urban versus rural residences in that residential modeling, which we're going to do away with, but we're going to introduce a classification of residences by income strata. And so we'll be able to track what's happening a little bit better by income strata as well. But that one is more straightforward and maybe not as far reaching. And then in the other sectors, we're not anticipating structural changes, just updates to data. You will, as Jane said, have an opportunity to review the results of the baseline scenario comprehensively when we meet for that in May. So back to you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Jason and Jane. So for today's presentation, we will be focusing on the transport sector only. And as Jane said, we won't go too much into the details of the LEAP model and how it all works, but we'll just do a quick refresher on the current transport modeling methods. We'll walk you through the current modeling structure. We'll go through some of the issues that we've identified. And then outline the proposed changes both in the structure and in the methods, which are all really aimed at addressing some of those issues that we will point out. And finally, we'll just open the floor for feedback and discussion. So to start, let's just look at how the Vermont LEAP model currently handles the transport sector. So specifically, we have disaggregated the transport sector into non-road and on-road subsectors, and the model covers both a historical period and a period of projections. So starting with the non-road subsectors, which include rail, aviation, and navigation, basically the model collects historical data, which is drawn from the EIA's State Energy Data System, or the SEDS. And this data provides the total energy consumption by fuel type within each of these subsectors. So it's a relatively high level approach. And then for projections, the model uses a fairly simple method, which is just estimating an energy intensity. In other words, it calculates each fuel's per capita consumption, and then it multiplies that by the population projections in Vermont. So that's the non-road subsectors. For the on-road subsectors, the modeling methods are a lot more detailed and data intensive. So again, we have a historical period versus a projections period. And in this case, for the historical period, the model represents the vehicle stock in Vermont using the latest year of the DMV registration data, which was available at that time when this version of the model was put together. And so that year is 2019. For earlier years, so the historical period, I believe it's from 2015 through 2018, we relied on other data sources like the Federal Highway Administration data and the vision model from Argonne National Lab to basically reconstruct a historical stock of all of the vehicles. And we had to make a bunch of assumptions here in order to reconcile all of the differences that exist between the different databases. And for the projections, the model uses what we call a stock turnover model, which essentially simulates how the vehicles are retired and replaced over time. So starting from that year of 2019, from the stock of vehicles from 2019, we model the sales of different types of vehicles and project them, along with future levels of fuel economy, the vehicle mileage, and emission factors, for example. And there are different types of what we call life cycle profiles that are used to describe how all of these aspects, like mileage and the fuel economy and the emissions, how all of these change as the vehicles age. So then LEAP, what it does is that it calculates the stocks of vehicles of all of the different ages, and then estimates the total energy consumption and the emissions. For these projections that are currently in the model, the LEAP structure basically grouped vehicles both by weight class and by drivetrain technology or fuel type, which really allows the model to reflect the different trends in, for instance, sales of electric vehicles or the phase out of diesel vehicles and so forth. But as we'll show you in a minute, the way in which these categories were grouped or in the way in which the model was structured doesn't quite align with key policies that we now want to represent in the model. So now let's move on to what are some of the main challenges that we've identified with the current structure and how the LEAP model is modeling the transport sector at the moment. One of the first issues, which I mentioned already, is that a lot of these different data sets that we're using don't always align. So the DMV registrations and the data from the Federal Highway Administration, the vision model, they all vary in time frames, in the resolution they use, in the estimation of the vehicle stocks, and more importantly, in how they classify the different vehicles. And this is an issue for us because we have to introduce a lot of different layers of assumptions in order to reconcile these data sources, which makes the model harder to maintain and generally a little bit less transparent. The other issue, which I touched on already, is that the vehicle categories in the current model don't cleanly align with these key policies like the Advanced Clean Cars 2 or the Advanced Clean Truck rules, which makes it a little bit harder for the model to accurately simulate the impacts of these policies. So those are the main reasons why we are proposing a slightly revised model structure and methods, particularly for the on-road subsectors. It's just to better reflect the state's goals and the regulatory frameworks. So I'll go through some of the main structural changes in the next couple of slides. But before I do, I also want to mention one more change that we're going to implement in this revision, which is more methodological, not so much structural, and that is that we will be using the most recent DMV data for the stock of vehicles, which is now data from mid 2024. So we'll be interpreting that as the stock of vehicles for 2023. But instead of just as as the current model does, instead of trying to reconstruct a historical stock of vehicles for a number of years, we will use for that historical period a more aggregated or top-down approach, more similar to what we did for the non-road subsectors. So we'll basically represent the historical energy demand by fuel type for the on-road subsector. And we'll do that only for the historical period. So it will allow us to still have a representation of the energy consumption and the historical emissions in alignment with the emissions inventory. And for the projections, we'll continue to use the stock turnover model, but with this revised model structure that we'll show you in a minute. So here in this slide, you will see with a little bit more detail the current model structure for the on-road sectors. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the vehicles grouped by weight category and by drivetrain technology.
Excuse me,
So-
Sylvia. I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but
Go
I
ahead.
don't know if you can see. Jared has raised a hand, so I think there's a
Oh,
clarification
no, I
question.
couldn't see that. Jared, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Sylvia. I'm wondering if we can just go back a slide, just a kind of a high-level context comment and question. And I think we're all on the same page here, and I don't want to kind of recover too much ground, but I think it's important to pause to say, there is this challenge of meeting the approach that the greenhouse gas inventory takes, which is, tracking emissions in the transportation sector primarily through, the most comprehensive and the most accurate data source we can find for that, which is primarily the fuel sales data as reported by the tax department and most easily accessible through the Joint Fiscal Office. And looking at those volumes sold of gasoline and diesel in the state and applying emissions factors. And, that's not all of it, but that's the biggest part of it. That kind of top-down approach versus the bottom-up approach that the LEAP model represents, which involves a lot of really valuable and important data, but a lot of assumptions in terms of combining the vehicle stock, the efficiency of those vehicles, the estimates of VMT. There's just more room for error. And so I'm really encouraged. I believe what I'm hearing is that you're building that stock model, that kind of bottom-up model to model the transportation sector. But before you go too far, you are calibrating it too and making sure that we're not seeing major inconsistencies with what's that stock bottom-up model is producing versus the data that we know we have from the tax department that would align with the official measure of progress we need to use on the emissions side per the inventory in the Global Warming Solutions Act.
You have it exactly
right. Am I hearing that correctly?
Jared, that is exactly what we're doing. Yeah, I mean, basically, we recognize that the inventory is based on a different estimation methodology fundamentally than the stock turnover methodology that we're discussing for projections. And so we want to try to replicate the inventory approach for the historical period. That's the top-down approach. That's what we're going to do. That will tie out exactly to the inventory. But then in our first year of the bottom-up simulation, we have to make sure that there's not a major disconnect between the inventory and what our bottom-up model is telling us, and that's where we do the calibration. And so we're going to calibrate the road model using looking at both fuel economy and VMT. And because we're deriving, there are various data inputs that we're using for those, which might not be exactly right in every single category of vehicle for the fleet in Vermont. If we could get Vermont specific data for all of those inputs, of course, we would use them. But we have to use some other sources for things like fuel economy and even the mileage data. I think the mileage data probably would come from a Vermont specific source in this model. Sylvia, you might recall the fuel economy data are coming largely from national data sets. So we will apply then the calibration factors to those to make sure that there's not a major disconnect between the last year of the inventory data and the first year of the bottom-up projection. And if we can get, Sylvia said we have stock data for 2023, essentially end of 2023. So if we can get even preliminary inventory results for 2023, what we'll do is we'll run the bottom-up model for 2023 and we'll look at the inventory for 2023 and we'll do the calibration to the inventory that way. If we can't get 2023 inventory data, then we'll just make sure that there's not a big step change between the inventory in 2021 or 2022, whatever the last year is that we can get. We know 2021 is public, 2022 is not public yet. And then the first year of the bottom-up projection in 2023.
And Brian has been coordinating with Jeff in hopes of going all the way through 2024 with RCI and transportation.
And if we can get through 2024, then we'll calibrate through 2024. Yep, that'd be great.
If it's okay, I know it's a little weedy, but I just want to flag one other thing for this conversation for us all to be aware of, which is I think that there's also a challenge, and I know that there's different ways, and I'm curious to hear, this can be later, how you're handling it, is that even if we get as accurate as possible stock data on the makes and models and the efficiencies of Vermont vehicles, there's also the issue of some of those vehicle miles travel out of state, and some of the emissions that are happening within Vermont's borders are not related to Vermont's vehicle fleet. It's the fuel purchases of people from away, since we're doing an in-boundary inventory, which is the fuel sales and consumption and emissions that then come from those fuel sales within the state. And so, I imagine that there is some calibration to account for the fuel sales and emissions that come from the non-Vermont fleet of people buying fuel here.
Yeah.
Which is
so the calibration that we'll do to the historical inventory will implicitly account for that.
Yeah.
Because we're trying to reproduce the historical inventory numbers, and then the assumption going forward is going to be there's some relationship between these two factors that you're talking about, right? Out-of-staters coming and purchasing fuel and using it, purchasing fuel in state, and Vermonters driving out of state, right? There's some relationship between those two, and the assumption in the model going forward is going to be that relationship remains constant over time.
Right, and it's, what's obvious is as we're using the JFO data, that does not, for the inventory, that does not differentiate between who's doing these miles or where they're happening. It's only fuel consumption. So, unless we do something with that data, which we're not planning on doing right now, because it would be based on another series of assumptions, that's going to be the data set that we are going to be used for, gasoline and diesel in the inventory. Thanks, Jason. And Sylvia, go ahead.
Thanks. So coming back to the model structure, so with a little bit more detail on how the current model structure is laid out, we have grouped the vehicles by weight category and by drivetrain technology. So the model currently has 4 vehicle, what we call categories, which are passenger cars, light trucks, medium duty, and heavy duty. And then a number of technologies or drivetrain technologies, which are listed down here. So the combination of these two, the categories and the technologies, gives us the list of all of the vehicle types that are included in the model. So you'll see passenger cars running on gasoline, different types of electric vehicles, and so forth. So this is the current model structure. So the first proposed change that we want to bring forward is changing the disaggregation of these vehicle types by weight class so that they more cleanly map to the relevant policy. So instead of having these 4 categories, passenger cars, light trucks, medium duty, and heavy duty, we would represent the different vehicle classes 1 through 8, so more disaggregation, we won't necessarily represent each one of those separately. So we might decide to group some of these based on what I'll show you in the next slide, which is really just a way for us to be able to represent the different policies. So that's the first big change that we're proposing. The second one is to move away from the current differentiation of electric vehicles based on driving range. So you'll see that for each of the electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, we have 3 different types which represented different driving ranges. So this was useful at some point, but now it just introduces unnecessary complexity. So we're just proposing to simplify this and just using one representative plug-in technology and one battery electric vehicle technology with an average battery and range. And finally, the third thing is that we're also recommending to remove some technologies that no longer appear in the DMV vehicle registration data. For example, the E85 flex fuel or the natural gas vehicles. These don't appear in the most recent data that we have from the DMV. So we're suggesting to remove this and to also remove technologies like diesel hybrids, which don't seem to have such an important presence in the market or are not expected to emerge in these scenarios that we're going to be looking at. So coming back to this first proposed change on the vehicle classes, we need to make sure that we strike a good balance between adding enough resolution to represent the important policies, but also avoid making the model overly complicated and harder to maintain. So this slide right here just has a summary of the low and zero emission vehicle rules that are applicable to Vermont, each of which affects different categories of vehicles. So for example, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 affects the passenger cars and the 1 and 2A categories. So there are sales requirements and emission standards that need to be met for these types of vehicles. On the other hand, the Advanced Clean Trucks rule applies to vehicle categories from 2B all the way through 8, but there are different sales requirements that are applicable to 3 different groups of vehicles. So there's a set of requirements applicable to classes 2B and 3, another one for classes 4 through 8, and another one for specifically class 7 and 8 tractors. We then have the heavy duty engine and vehicle omnibus rule, which has NOx and PM emission reductions requirements. So GHG emission standards basically that are applicable for classes 3 through 8, and the phase 2 greenhouse gas rule, which applies to classes 2B through 8. So you see that each of these rules basically groups or assigns either sales requirements or emission standards to the different groups of vehicles. So based on all of these policies, our proposal is to group some of these vehicle categories as you can see here. So we would have the passenger cars, then we would have a group of the classes 1 and 2A, which are subject to the Advanced Clean Cars 2. Then we would have the group 2B, which is subject to both the Advanced Clean Trucks rule and to the phase 2 greenhouse gas rule. The class 3, which would be applicable, which would be subject to all of these 3 policies. We would have a group of classes 4 through 6. And then for classes 7 and 8, we would have 2 separate groups. One grouping what we call, or what the policies call, the straight trucks, and a separate one for the 7 and 8 tractors. So how would this look then in terms of the model structure? So we would have 8 categories of vehicles instead of the 4 that I showed you previously. So we would have motorcycle, passenger cars, then we would have class 1A and class 2B, which was what previously or in the current model were all grouped under the light vehicles. We would have class 3 modeled separately, classes 4 and 6 grouped, and these two comprised what in the current model were the medium duty. And then for the heavy duty, we would have two groups, the classes 7 and 8 straight trucks and class 7 and 8 tractors. And in terms of the technologies, we've just, as I mentioned, we've cleaned up the vehicle technologies to include only those that already exist in the stock as per the DMV registration data, plus additional technologies that are considered important for the future scenarios. So again, combining the vehicle categories and the technologies, this would be the revised list of vehicles to represent in the model. So this is the main structural change in the model. This would be the list of technologies. And in this chart right here, just so you can see how the stock of vehicles from July 2024 maps to all of these different categories and technologies, it's just for you to have a sense of the distribution and the relative importance of each category. So you can see that the stock is largely dominated by gasoline and gasoline hybrid, passenger cars, and those in classes 1 and 2A. So the main advantages of these proposed structure or approach are that it increases the transparency, so it minimizes a lot of the assumptions that are required to reconcile all of these databases, which makes the model simpler to maintain moving forward. It also ensures that it's more aligned or that it better represents the state's official emissions inventory. But more importantly, I think that it provides a better representation of the upcoming vehicle policy. So it can make it easier for us to represent the impacts of those in this model version. So we would love to hear your feedback on these changes, especially on the revised categories and the technologies. Specifically, if there are any other policies also that we should be accounting for in this update or that we should consider as we decide which categories we can group. If there are any potential concerns about this new structure that maybe we haven't addressed. And yeah, I'll just leave it there and we can open it up for discussion. Jared, I see your hand is up. Go ahead, please.
First, just thank you for a really great, thorough presentation. I would say that overall, I think that the direction that you're proposing moving in makes a lot of sense for all of the reasons that you just outlined on the slide before. The one question and a little bit of a concern I have relates to moving away from having different types of, as you label them, battery electric vehicles, sometimes called all electric vehicles, to just having one average BEV. And the reason I say that is I think, as we look ahead to trying to understand the impact of different policies, programs, incentives, there's one really important piece of information that my hunch is that it is changing over time is how many vehicle miles and how much fuel use is a battery electric vehicle or an all electric vehicle that replaces a fossil fuel vehicle actually displacing. And my sense is that, there've been a lot of studies about this nationally and regionally, and I'm sure you're familiar with them. But a lot of information is saying that we're not getting a one-for-one replacement. And it makes sense in the early stages, right? With electric vehicles whose range that don't have a really long range, they're not able to fully replace the miles and fuel use of the fossil vehicle that they may have replaced in terms of the vehicle registration or that vehicle's place in a driveway or a garage, especially, you know, with 2-vehicle households where someone may get an electric vehicle, but they're going to shift some of those. You might see more miles and more fuel consumption on their remaining gas vehicle than you would on their electric vehicle. But my sense is that that's going to change over time. The more that we move from battery electric vehicles that have, you know, say 150 to 200 mile range to a 250 to 300 mile range. And so my hope would be that in the model, we could have enough resolution to be able to model the effect of policies, programs, and incentives around EVs that are displacing more fuel and replacing more vehicle miles from their fossil counterparts than just one big average. And I imagine that the amount of emissions reduction we get from EVs is going to improve over time, especially as we have farther range EVs that can replace more miles from the fossil vehicles. So that's just a question and concern, like, is there a risk in not being able to have that resolution in the different ranges and utilizations of electric vehicles, since that's one of the key policy levers that we're going to be looking at?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Jared. I mean, there are also important or potentially important differences on the cost side between those lower range and those higher range EVs. We could handle this either way. Like we can bake everything into averages and, you know, write formulas that account for some of these substitution effects that you're talking about. It will be a little bit more transparent if we maintain the multiple categories of EVs in particular. I don't think it's as much of an issue on the plug-in hybrid side. I could be swayed either way. I'm trying to remember, Brian, the genesis of this idea. Was it just that we felt that we hadn't used those really that differentiation in EV categories in the previous work, so it wasn't worth retaining it? Or what do you recollect?
It was partly that, and then just partly, you know, that again, your effort to simplify the model and not having all these categories. I think it's an interesting question. Say, yeah, if a one-car household replaces a fossil fuel vehicle with an EV, right? It is close to 1-to-1, right? Maybe some two or multiple car households are doing what you said, Jared, but but some of them are actually driving the EV more, for all the reasons that we're saying that they're good, right? Because it's less expensive and they're, need less maintenance, and the vehicle is potentially newer than the one that they have. I don't know that comes out in the wash one way or another, but I think, the dynamic works on both sides. I think, people get these vehicles because they want to drive them. So, but we don't have, VTrans doesn't have that kind of data on like vehicle utilization based upon fuel type. No. So I've
been a lot of research.
Jason, I could be swayed, but I am convinced that trying to do things on the simpler side is kind of the direction that we want to go. And we weren't really doing anything with that vehicle range differentiation. And on the new vehicle side, it's like, the market's not really delivering those 150 mile EVs anymore because they don't need to, and people are preferentially going to a longer range vehicle.
That is true. Yeah. And I mean, back when we first created this model, a lot of those EVs on the market, they got 70 mile ranges, 90 mile ranges, right? 115 mile range for a Leaf. I remember that era if you went for the enhanced battery pack. Yeah, I do think the market is moving away from that.
Harry, I see you're posted about a study that you're doing. I'd like to learn more about that.
So the study is looking at the Vermont Agency of Transportation Clean Transportation Incentives. So these enabled Vermonters to purchase all electric vehicles plug-in hybrids, both new and used. And we're looking at household level data. So using the VIN to, and the registration and the annual inspection odometer to find the household and look at what vehicles did they own before the incentive, and then what after they got the incentive, how did they balance their mileage between multiple vehicles, and looking a couple years out as much as we can. So this is currently in the works. We're like 2 quarters into the research, and there was a lot of cleanup. So there was a lot of like, how do we find the households that don't have, haven't moved? And unfortunately, it's a smaller subset that we're able to actually study than we'd hoped, given address changes and some fields that the DMV did not share with UVM. But we are hoping to have more of those results soon to see how is that incentive changing household travel behavior, because we wanted to, understand, are people actually using the electric vehicle more or less than their internal combustion engine vehicle? Some preliminary results do show that just overall, not at the household level, but overall, these incentivized vehicles are being driven at a comparable annual mileage to internal combustion engine vehicles, and they're being retained for multiple years, because we had been concerned that we would see lower mileage or higher turnover.
Jared, go ahead.
Yeah, first, I'm really encouraged to hear news of, or to hear more about that study from Ari. That's great that we'll have more Vermont specific information. I posted in the chat, there's been some good research out of MIT that suggests that there are pretty significant differences in usage depending on range. And so to me, I mean, we'll see how much that continues to be the case. I'd encourage folks to click through and look at that link. It does feel to me like, if it's possible, if it's not a lot of extra work or expense, maintaining a greater degree of resolution between EV types may end up being beneficial to us, especially when we get into the pathways modeling, in terms of modeling different policies and programs that may target different types of vehicles differently.
Yeah. I don't think it's a problem for us to retain some categorization there of a few different types of EVs we're talking about. I think we're just talking about passenger cars and light trucks. So in our new typology, it's passenger cars and the class 1 and 2A trucks that we'd be talking about. And I don't think that's really a heavy lift to do that. I am curious, though, in the latest data that we can find, how those data would break down types of EVs, and whether that low mileage class, the low mileage type from 5-6 years ago is really still relevant in the data. So we can look into that, but I think we could just take a note on that and try to provide some differentiation of types of EVs that will be useful for decision making and for some of the results. Because I do think the cost differences in EVs can also be really important, and the efficiency differences can be really important. Whether someone's operating at the really high end and driving around a 2-ton EV, or a smaller EV makes a big difference. Good. Other feedback or comments?
I was just thinking about your comment about efficiency, and I've seen a couple resources talking about how we need to switch from miles per gallon to gallons per 100 miles, because that makes it much more clear that, like, changing from 25 miles per gallon to 21 miles per gallon isn't always as advantageous as switching from a light truck. So the miles per gallon can be a little bit obscured by, we read that as a flat number, but it's really like the scale of it. So I don't think I'm articulating this very well, but I can share a resource that made me think about it more. And I wonder if something like that could be worked into the model, or maybe that's just something we want to consider on our public messaging. But something that
Yeah,
stuck with me.
I'm not totally sure that I've grasped what you're talking about, Ari. Sylvia,
Yeah.
maybe you have, and I'm just being dense this
Let
afternoon.
me
But
share this article that will
yeah,
articulate it
do.
much better than
I would say
can.
this though about what the model does. So the model's not interested in miles per gallon per se. It's interested in energy use per unit of driving that happens, and that can be framed in multiple ways in the model. Like you can put your data in as miles per gallon. You can put your data in as gallons per mile. You can put your data in as kilowatt hours per kilometer. I mean, you know, there are a lot of different ways you can put your data in, and it just gets normalized to some standard unit on the back end, and it can be reported out in multiple units as well. So, so we do have that flexibility. Let me have a look at this link that you sent to. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking about also, is there a way, like, how is this data communicating with the DMV data? And is it looking at just registrations for that like baseline for the projection? And is there a regular kind of truing up that's going to happen? And I'm also interested in which vehicles are doing the most driving. And we do have that data available with the annual inspection odometer reading. And it would be interesting to know, you know, within different quintiles of, you know, weekly miles per gallon or annual, weekly miles driven or annual miles driven, are any of the vehicles in that top quintile electric, or all of the, you know, like really high mileage drivers sticking with lower efficiency vehicles? Because if we can really target those higher mileage drivers, we'll achieve much more impactful greenhouse gas emission reductions than if we convert all of the lower mileage drivers.
Yeah, I don't think we have sufficient data to make that distinction in the model right now, but if you can point us to some data that we could use to make that differentiation, I think we could try to include that. Sure. What do you think, Sylvia?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we currently have that data. So right now, the data that we have from the DMV, I think it's a subset of the entire database that was shared with us. And we don't have any specific data on like the miles driven for the average miles driven for each of these cars. So we just use the data from the DMV to calculate the stock of the different categories. But then all of these other parameters, I think we're using the vision model, which is basically averages, like national averages. Then we do the calibration.
And regarding your question about the updates, if I understood it correctly, so we're doing this baseline update, this comprehensive baseline update to the model with these revisions and updated data, and then we're going to use this baseline as the reference case for scenarios to be considered for the climate action plan. And as Jane said at the outset, like we're under a very compressed time schedule. We do have SEI under contract all the way to 2027. So we are contemplating, an update to the baseline at some point. But it's not something we're thinking about doing like annually, because again, we're kind of on the sequence of the climate action plans.
Thank you.
Yeah, Sylvia did raise a good point, and I'm looking at the model now, and she's quite right that the VMT, the miles traveled for vehicles, comes ultimately from the Argonne National Laboratory vision model. So a national data set, not Vermont specific. We don't have the vehicle miles traveled data from a Vermont specific source. If you can point us to something, we'll try to get it in to this update. But at the moment, we have the stock from the Vermont specific source, and we have a national data source for the usage of vehicles, including the evolution of vehicle miles traveled as a vehicle ages. Jared?
My recollection, and Ari or Andrea, please add to this if it makes sense. My recollection is that in the previous years, and I don't think one has been produced in the last couple of years, but the transportation energy profile that used to be contracted by VTrans and published by VTrans had statewide total VMT and per capita VMT estimates that my recollection is they came from Federal Highway Administration, FHWA. So it might be worth checking into that and cross-referencing that, because I Vermont is certainly an outlier in the region, and it in New England more VMT than other New England states, certainly less than some Western states. But I would be concerned that if we're using average VMT from a national data set, that it may not be reflective of or as accurate as more state-specific data. I can follow up on that as well, but that would be this place I would start, is looking at the transportation energy profile and the information that is historically shared on total VMT in the state, which I again believe comes from FHWA.
Yeah, total VMT is interesting, but remember what we're trying to do in the stock modeling is we need to have a couple of parameters for each type of vehicle that Sylvia outlined. We need to know how much is a new vehicle of that type. Let's say passenger cars, plug-in hybrid, a particular type of plug-in hybrid. How many miles per year is a new vehicle driven, and then how does that change over time as the vehicle ages? So we have these parameters from the vision model for each of the different types of vehicles that we've been talking about. Total VMT would give us something we might be able to calibrate against as a first round of calibration, but unless the VMT in that transportation energy profile, or unless the VMT is broken down by these really granular types of vehicles, it would be hard to use directly.
Yeah, let me see if I can find that. I remember it being reported both ways, total and...
Good. So we'll have a look at that. I've taken a note on that. Thanks. Okay, floor is back open again, I think, for other comments. Well, if we don't have other comments at the moment, Brian and Jane, maybe do we want to just say a few words about next steps, where we're going from here? And what
I did find it, and I'm happy to share it very briefly.
Oh, you did? Oh, great. Do, please.
If I can just, is it okay to share my screen? So I don't know if it's been updated since then, but this is from page 7 of the 2021 transportation energy profile, and it has VMT per capita for Vermont for the period of 2007 to 2019. And it lists the sources, Federal Highway. I'll put this link in the, but.
Yeah, so fundamentally, if these data are coming from Federal Highway Administration, then there may be some more disaggregated data underlying.
But, you can see that we're on average 2,000 more miles a year than the national average.
Right.
So I think it's a really good flag and an important point that we should be using Vermont specific data rather than a national average.
Right.
That's for historical. I'm a little confused. Like, we're going to line this up for the latest reporting year that we have for the inventory. But I guess I'm feeling like we're conflating historical data with the way the projections are going to work.
That's correct, Brian. Yeah. Yeah. But in the projections, we have to have some, this is VMT per capita, which is, it's not per type of vehicle, right? It's not how much each individual vehicle is driven. Right. But if we'll look at the underlying data from FHWA, if there's something in there that can actually be mapped to our vehicle types, then we could use that in the model, right? We can use the last observed historical data as a starting point for the the usage of vehicles in the future. I mean, I think that that's the idea here, that these historical data would give us an input that we can use in the projection models. The specific input that we're talking about is let's to simplify things, let's say it's the number of miles that each new vehicle is driven per year.
Yep.
And where we're trying to get to is in the latest reporting year that we have for the inventory. We want to align those emissions, in the end, those emissions, with what's coming out of the model. But then we have to change the methodology for the projections.
Yes.
It's just unavoidable. And you know, the projections are going to be helpful as a baseline, like I said, as the reference case for the scenarios that we're doing. But you know, they are, you know, they can't be the same methodology.
And I wonder if that may be part of the original, you know, really significant discrepancy between the emissions estimates that were coming out of the LEAP model versus what we were seeing in the tax department data. If part of it could be an under assumption on VMT in Vermont vehicles. But I do think that trying to use the most Vermont specific data, whether it's on the tax department side or on the VMT or fuel sales side, is our best.
Okay, so I see that we're 2 minutes to the top of the hour. Secretary Moore?
I do have a question there, because I think there's another factor in here, or challenge and potential disconnect, which is I suspect, given the importance of tourism to our economy, that there's more out-of-state gas purchase in Vermont. I know, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the assumption's always been Vermonters buy gas out of state people buy gas in Vermont, and we're going to call it a wash. But you know, I do worry we're getting really nuanced, and there are some other potentially big ticket factors in here, and don't want to create a sense of accuracy that just isn't possible with the information we have available. And so I'm always a fan of keeping it simpler and higher level, unless we really have data to drill down and make those kinds of more specific sets of assumptions.
Yeah, the model, I mean, it can never be like the crystal ball for the inventory. It's the baseline that we're building to be able to compare scenarios, things that we can do to be able to increase the pace of decarbonization and emissions. We'll try and make it as accurate as possible, but you know, again, it cannot be, if it doesn't match, you know, the inventory in future years, that doesn't make it wrong. You know, it's just that that's the way the model works as this tool to be able to say, if we do these other things, here are the results that we can expect from the way we're doing things now. Can't emphasize that enough.
But as much as we can do to improve the accuracy and the calibration, we should.
Absolutely. I've said that from the beginning, Jared. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I do think the calibration is, I mean, obviously it's going to be better now because it's actually going to be calibrated to the inventory, right? Which is the point of departure that everyone agrees on. That calibration is going to allow us to account for a number of different factors that are not explicitly represented in the model, like this balance between, well, Vermonters drive some miles out of state and out-of-staters come and purchase gas and diesel in Vermont. But also other things that we haven't even discussed here today. There are myriad details that go into this model, and still even more that are not taken into account in the model. Calibration is going to help us with that. And as long as and that's probably fine for a business as usual scenario, as long as these implicit factors, their influence on the outcome remains more or less constant in the future, then you have a legitimate baseline projection. I agree with you, Jared. Where we can incorporate additional information, we should, while being mindful of what the secretary said, that we want to have something that you can explain to people as well. And I think we're at a reasonably good balancing point on that right now, and the better calibration is going to help a lot.
Okay, any other questions, comments? Going once, going twice.
Nathan and Sylvia, thanks everybody. Oh, sorry, go ahead,
Are
Joey.
you gonna, sorry, the next steps piece, like, can you just refresh my memory again? And then also, yeah, just want to express my appreciation for the time and the work and the opportunity to provide input. So thank you. And yeah, any further context on like moving forward would be great.
Want to do that, Brian, or?
Oh, no, I thought that was to Jason. Since the next step is.
I was gonna let
Whomever.
Jane field that one, since she sent out, or you and she sent out such an apposite email on that.
So,
but I'm happy to.
Well, understanding that the RCI sector and the transportation sector are the two largest sectors, and having the best data possible on those as soon as possible, those are the two that have been moved to the front of sort of the work order for SEI. And I believe we're supposed to have those by the end of next week, those two sectors for the business as usual model, and then working to revise the other components of the business as usual model by the end of the month. So we have a full and complete draft by May 1st or 2nd. And that allows us to present that model. We have a tentative schedule that we're actually talking about with the steering committee tomorrow around presenting the business as usual at the May 5th council meeting, and then have some ideas about how we can work in parallel to both receive further revisions, edits, considerations for the business as usual model, while also starting to build off of it some scenarios in hopes of having 2 scenarios completed in June. And we're working on finalizing that statement of work right now with Jason and Sylvie around a compliance scenario to meet the 2030, the measures needed, and then an extended timeline scenario, understanding that the challenges around sort of like the measure mix and the economics of meeting 2030, just so we can have some discussion points with the council. But then knowing that we'll have this broader statement of work to do all additional scenarios beyond the time we adopt the climate action plan at the July 1st. So that's what's next. So the next time the council and Jason and Jared and I talked about this briefly yesterday, just on a discussion about science and data. You know, there's a balance here around. It's always great to have some feedback earlier, like to have science and data involved, but understanding the timeline that we're working on. We're just going to present the business as usual model to the council and invite science and data members to join, and that's more of a challenge for us to sort of receive that feedback there and then with everybody, but hopefully we're trying to fend that off through conversations like this.
Okay, and then last question, super simple, across the board, the modeling with the federal uncertainty.
Yeah, there's a couple things. We haven't really talked about that a ton with Jason and Sylvie, but I know that like Brian, we're also doing modeling right now with the Climate Alliance. And they're actually doing some different scenarios on federal rollbacks, how extensive the impacts will be. And we'll probably start to talk a little bit more about that with Jason and Sylvie. And forgive me if we already have talked about how we're doing that. I can't
We
remember.
haven't really.
Okay,
no.
yeah.
So it's another element that we can take into account. I'd be very interested what U.S. Climate Alliance is doing on that. So let's follow up on that.
Yeah.
Thank you for all of that.
Okay.
For coming, everybody, on such short notice. It's really helpful to have your eyes on it sooner than later.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, SEI team. That was really really helpful, and everybody else for coming. And wish you all a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.